Well, greetings from a very snowy Boston. I hope everyone who is impacted by the blizzard in the northeast of the United States is staying safe and warm today. I notice everyone signing in. Thank you for joining us from all around the globe today. We're expecting a lot of participants. Today's webinar, Organize Your Mind for Coaching, is going to be hosted by our very own co-founder and co-director of the Institute of Coaching, Margaret Moore. And we are also very fortunate to have our guest, Dr. Shelley Carson, psychologist and lecturer at Harvard University. My name is Stephanie Gerard, and I'm the Manager of Education, Research, and Marketing at the Institute of Coaching. If you have any specific queries following the webinar, please feel free to reach out to me. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few logistical details. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please feel free to send them to us via the webinar question function. Shelley and Margaret will try to respond to your questions throughout the duration of the webinar. Due to the higher participation today, all attendee audio has been muted to avoid any background noise. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the library section of the ICPA website within a week. There will be a survey following the webinar, and we'd appreciate if everyone would complete the survey. If you wish to receive any CEUs, completion of the survey is obligatory. And I would now like to hand it over to Margaret.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello from Margaret Moore, also in snowy Boston area. And Shelley, do you want to say hello? Shelley's also in the area.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am looking out the window of my office right now, and the snow is up about 2.5 feet, but the sun is shining, I'm happy to say. Hi, everyone.
So let me start by sharing that today's session and a much bigger body of work that is behind this evolved out of a collaboration that started a few years ago because Shelley and I are both authors of Harvard Health books, and I want to just pay gratitude to Jilly Silver, who was our editor at the time, who brought us together, and we are now collaborating on many projects, including this one today, and we are very excited about this program and delighted to be able to share it with you. This is a shorter version of what we did in our track last fall, which was the first time we had done this format as a workshop. We got called in at the last minute because one of our track leaders was unable to come to the conference, and we've been doing this more since, so we're a little more prepared today. I want to mention first that Shelley and I do have a conflict of interest around what we're presenting today. We are about to launch an online and mobile tool course based on what we're presenting. It's a very large, comprehensive program at organizeyourmind.com. And so, the material that we're presenting to you today is subject to copyright, but we invite you to share it. We would really request that you cite us as this is novel and inventive work. In fact, there's a patent being filed around the extension of this work in many areas in the next day or so. So this program has many contributors and collaborators, and I mentioned Shelley and I, and she'll tell you a little bit more about the work that she's done in the last 5+ years. My first step into this field of organizing your mind and thinking about the brain was a collaboration with Paul Hammerness, who's a child psychiatrist, and our book, Organize Your Mind, Organize Your Life, is based on the principles of attention deficit disorder, something that many of us are struggling with today given the overload and overwhelm and the compelling and addictive devices that we all deal with. And so it's the work with Paul that kind of created a foundation for what we're doing today. Then I want to pay tribute to a neuroscientist who graduated from Harvard, who is in Minneapolis, Wilma Kutzdahl, who put together a 600-page book on cognitive agility called The Agile Mind. Came out just less than 2 years ago. It's an enormous an enormous and dense piece of work, and it inspired one of the pieces of this model, which I'll tell you about. Shelley, I mentioned, and she'll tell you a little bit more when we get to her piece. And then Ron Zilka is an electrical engineer based in Israel now, who is an expert in positive computing and behavior change technology, having built apps with Sonia Lyubomirsky and Deepak Chopra and Oprah and others. So he has helped us translate this platform into technological tools for teaching and in habit making. So what's the need here? I don't really need to say a lot about this. You all know what it's like to be human today. We have a growing epidemic, and it's not really abating, of too busy, high-pressured, depleted, frenzied, distracted, addicted, disorganized minds. And for many of us, we are beginning to notice that brain performance is suffering. I was asked to do a keynote around this for the American Association of Thoracic Surgeons last year because senior surgeons are deeply distressed that the ability of new surgeons and surgical teams, young people today, are unable to sustain their focus for an entire operation. And that is because they've become so distracted and distractible, even when they've got gloves on and are not looking at devices, they're unable to keep their attention focused on one thing. And one can imagine that the next generation of workers, at least in some professional domains, may not be as competent as their peers, or sorry, as their mentors. Here's a study done a few years ago by a group that creates technology for Apple devices, showed that almost 60% of adults believe they're addicted to checking their smartphones. And if you're under 34, it's almost 70%. So most of us are struggling with this, and many of you are following the news and books and literature around distracted driving. There are more than 3,000 deaths a year now from distracted drivers. People who are, for whom checking a text, an email, or a phone call is actually more important than their safety and safety of others on the road. And that is a first sign of addiction, when you begin to harm yourself and others. And if we are in this distractible, somewhat obsessed, addicted state, what is impaired is the brain's ability to focus. Our memory doesn't work. We can't remember well. We can't think well. We can't collaborate. We can't create, connect. We don't learn. The brain doesn't learn well in this state, and we certainly aren't performing at our best. Our brains are really struggling to do all these things that we need to do, to connect, to focus, to create, to be agile, to all of these things that, in fact, many of us, even as coaches who do have these deep focus periods when we're coaching, are still finding ourselves caught up in this epidemic that we all face. And in the workplace, engagement, productivity, agility, strategic thinking, creativity, these are all never been needed more to deal with the VUCA world. And so this is the time that we need to take back control of our minds and to use our brains the way they were designed to be used. So if you're going to organize your mind, the first question to ask is, where is your mind right now? And I'm going to help you find it if you're not sure. So this is a two-dimensional map or locator. I mentioned Wilma Kutzdahl in her book, The Agile Mind. She had come up with 2 dimensions for thinking about agility, and that is the idea that led to this 2-dimensional map. On one dimension, we have, on the far left, high executive control, where your mind, if you think about the mind as the energetic field, the capacity to control or direct the brain to the extent that we have control, so that at the highest level of control of our brain's performance, we're on the far left of this map. And on the far right is when we let go of control. So daydreaming, mind wandering, those are the states that live at the far right. Sleep, of course, goes even further because the prefrontal cortex goes to sleep and our mind is free to wander as we dream our beautiful dreams or not so beautiful dreams at night. Then from top to bottom, at the top we have the thinking brain states where we are in our heads, so to speak. So our attentional resources are in our thoughts, in the prefrontal cortex, and we are not living in our senses. So the bottom here of this dimension is are the experiencing states and regions where we are in our senses. We're in our sensory regions. We're sensing what's happening in our bodies. We're sensing our emotions. We're sensing on the outside world through our eyes, our ears, our touch, our smell. And this is one domain of this map where most of us could spend more time, and that's why there's such an interest in mindfulness and meditation today. So another thing to think about with this map is that generally most of us are stronger in one domain than another. So some of us spend more time up in the top left of this map where we are thinking, evaluating, critiquing, judging, prescribing, planning, all of those left prefrontal cortex, highly controlled executive CEO kinds of activities. Then those of you out there who lean towards more impulsive, spontaneous, nonlinear, creative minds live more in the middle towards the right of this map. As I said, most of us spend too little time in the bottom part of this map. And so one of the interesting things that comes out of mapping our brain states in this way is that there are opportunities for all of us to do more and to live more in the brain states where we don't spend a lot of time today. So I'm going to pass it over to Shelley, because Shelley is the one who built these brain states. So Shelley, over to you to tell the story.
Okay, well, much of this work came from the work that I had been doing in the field of creativity. One of the things that I was very interested in is how can all of us, when I know that there's natural creativity in every brain, how can we enhance our own natural creativity? So I began to look at the neuroscience of different creative brain states, and those people who are highly creative, it turned out, were much more flexible and agile at changing brain activation states depending upon the stage of the creative process that they were in. And I began to think about this. Well, if we can identify these brain activation states, then we can mimic the states of highly creative people, and we can train ourselves to become more creative. In fact, we know that we have the capacity to mimic different brain activation states because a lot of work from the field of cognitive behavioral therapy and also cognitive enhancement therapies has shown that we can actually change our brain activation states. So at that point I began to identify different states that were associated with different parts of the creative process, and since then I've extended it by working with Margaret to identify states that are associated with different tasks that coaches would be interested in and that would be valuable for us as we go through our everyday lives. What I'm going to tell you about now are a few hotspots in the brain, just to identify them so you'll have an idea of what we're talking about as we go forward in this course. But one thing I do want to say is even though there are some parts of the brain that are associated with specific tasks or specific functions, in fact, most of the functions, most of the higher order cognitive functions that we use involve multiple areas of the brain that are all connected together in networks. So I want you to think of networks as being activated in different brain activation states. That being said, let's look at some of the components of these different networks. And the first thing I want to do is look at the executive center. So you'll see in your brain chart there a large orange area near the front of the brain. That's what I call the executive center. Technically, it's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And in this area of the brain, this is associated with thinking logically, sequentially, when you're planning for the future, when you're thinking abstractly, or when you're making conscious decisions. Sometimes I call the executive center the CEO. And for most people, it's stronger in the left hemisphere than it is in the right hemisphere because the left hemisphere is the seat of language, and much of our thought occurs in language. Closely related to that executive center, if you look down below it, you'll see what I'm calling the judgment center. And this includes parts of the brain that include the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbital frontal cortex. And combined with the executive center, these are the parts of the brain that allow you to make rapid judgments about and make rapid decisions. Next, we'll go to the me center and the you center, which are blue areas to the left of the brain chart. The me center, which is actually the medial prefrontal cortex, is the part of the brain that is involved in self-referential thinking. So when you're thinking about yourself, when you're comparing yourself to others, or when you're thinking about anything having to do with yourself, that part of the brain, the center line area there, is activated. The you center is just what I would say just north of this, and this part of the brain is active when you are trying to take another person's perspective. So if I'm trying to put myself in your shoes and think of what you might be thinking or perceiving, that part of the brain lights up. So both the me center and the you center are located along the center line of the prefrontal cortex. Now just below the me center and the you center is another orange area that we call the frontal pole, and it's also related to higher cognitive functions such as reasoning and problem solving and multitasking. It's also active when you're consciously observing your own actions and feelings. And it may be activated independent from the judgment centers, and this is going to allow you to monitor your own thoughts and feelings without judging them. We'll be talking a little bit more about that later. The frontal pole also appears to be important in creating narratives or knitting together pieces of experience and information to form a cohesive story or a schema. Now, if you look around the top of the brain area there, you'll see a large light blue area. This is called the default network. And in conjunction with the me center and the you center, this is the part of the brain that lights up when you're not consciously and deliberately directing your thoughts. That's why it's called default. The brain defaults to that when you're not consciously and deliberately thinking. So this part of the brain is associated with mind wandering. Going to the very back of the brain, you'll see the vision center. The vision center takes up the occipital cortex of the brain, and we've devoted a lot of real estate to processing vision. Vision is so important in all of our thinking, in our remembering, in our perception, and our ability to solve problems. So there's a lot of area associated with vision. One of the really interesting things that has been found through brain imaging studies is when you imagine something in your brain, when you mentally image something, it actually turns on the same parts of the vision cortex that are active when you're actually perceiving information coming in from your eyes. So we're able to hijack that part of the brain hardware to use for imagination and creativity. Then there are also two blue areas called the association centers that are near the center of the brain. These areas I sometimes refer to as the research and development part of the brain because a lot of information from different parts of the brain comes together in these areas. Information from auditory, from your ears, vision information, and information that's stored in memory will all come together in the association centers to help you identify, say you see somebody walking down the street. Vision, the way they're moving, perhaps the sound of their voice, and memories about that person all come together in the association centers to help you identify that individual as Joe the butcher or Joe who lives next door. And then the final areas I want to talk about are very pale yellow. The pale yellow areas indicate parts of the brain that are below the cortex, deep within the brain. And there are three areas there that are very important to us. The first one is called the amygdala, or perhaps you know it as the fear center of the brain. So fear is processed here, and when the amygdala is lighted up, it generally means that you are experiencing anxiety or fear of some sort. Near that is the memory part of the brain, which is called the hippocampus. You don't need to know any of the technical terms, but this part of the brain is very important in memory and learning. Anytime something that you have recently experienced is being transferred into a long-term memory, it has to go through the hippocampus or the memory network. And then finally we have the reward center. This part of the brain, which is sometimes called the ventral striatum, is associated with reward, intrinsic motivation and reward. So when this area lights up, it makes it more likely that you will repeat behaviors or thoughts that you have just accomplished because you're being internally rewarded with a little shot of the neurotransmitter dopamine for doing that, and it feels good and you feel good about yourself. So these are what I call the hotspots of the brain, and I promise the anatomy lesson is over now, and I'm going to turn the session back over to Margaret.
Thank you, Shelley. Beautiful tour. So let's come back to the question I asked you earlier. Where is your mind right now? And let's get more familiar with the 4 quadrants of this map. So if you're up in the top left, you're thinking about what I'm saying. You might be analyzing it even. You might be saying, I don't disagree, I don't like that, or I don't like these colors, or whatever you're thinking about, you could well be in this state right now. Or you may be bored and your mind might be unleashed and off thinking about another topic. It may be a very important topic. You may have a big issue or challenge on your mind. Now, open awareness is a beautiful place. This is when all of your senses are open. This is when you are watching a sunset. This is when you're savoring everything that's happening around you. And this is Shelley will explain, is in fact a key brain state in the creative process, to be able to take in all that's around you inside and out, to notice new things. And so probably while you're listening here, you're not in this state, but this is a state that you might have used before you sat down and just took a few deep breaths and took in your surroundings. Now on the far left and in the experiencing, we have what we call the narrow awareness state. So this is when you're narrowly experiencing one sense, like when you're eating and just chewing and tasting your food, or when you're in a yoga class and your yoga instructor says to put your attention into your quadricep muscles, or when you're breathing in a breathing meditation. So that would be a state that you'd use when you're narrowly tuning in, not thinking, but focusing your sensory experience. Those are our 4 quadrants. Then what are the rules for using the brain states? What are the strategies for using all of these brain states? We're proposing these 5. First is to know where your mind and your brain are at, and know why they're in that place. So that's being intentional. That's reminding the brain of the purpose, the goal, the drive, the whatever the intention is for the next activity. That brings in attentional resources, the drive, the reward, potential reward, that energizes your ability to get into and hold and be deep in a brain state. Next is to go deep. You see these brain states have diverse regions, and they mix and match in special ways. To get the full juice out of each, you need to go, if you could imagine a beam of light, you need to go deep into each of these brain states to get the most out of what they offer. Then as you're moving around the map, as you're moving from one state to the next, it's important to be agile, to shift all of your brain's resources from one state to the next. And as you see from this map, that's not so easy to do because you're really changing what regions of the brain are active as you move these states. So it takes a lot of brain's resources to be agile. And often we're not. We think we're multitasking or sequential tasking, but in fact, we're leaving some attentional resources back in the old, earlier task, or even worrying about the future tasks. That's not agile. That's scattering and splattering your attention. Another way to be agile is that some of the brain states, just by virtue of what they are agile in themselves. The nonlinear creative brain states, the meta-awareness, we're going to talk about strategic thinking. So being agile within a task, going from zooming in to zooming out, going from thinking down to experiencing, going from high control to moderate control to low control. Within a task, you can also show agility. Then probably the newest idea of this whole framework is the idea that diversifying matters, that being diverse, actually using more of these brain states in a given day is in fact good for performance and creativity. That's yet to be shown in brain performance. I think Shelley and I would both say that this is important from our experience, but this is where there's really an opportunity for this model to be used to explore workflow and how we work in a day to produce peak performance and innovation, and what mix of brain states over time in a day or a week lead to peak performance. So that's more to come. And then last, we need to be energized. And where does the energy come from? There are really two sources. One is our emotional energy, the balance of positive emotions and negative emotions, how we settle the negative emotions so they don't, in fact, we don't get an overdose, which then impairs the mind's or the brain's ability to focus. And then physical energy from our nutrition, our sleep, and our exercise are also vital to make all of this work well. I'm just going to take a very quick moment to talk about the energy. This is not the focus of today's webinar, but I just want to show you this slide first around exercise, because this is a comparison of pre-adolescent kids about to take a test. And the control group read before the test, and the test group went for a 20-minute walk. This is a measure of attentional resources, and on the right after the walk, look at the big difference, the big increase in attentional resources available after some exercise. This is the power of exercise to increase blood flow and allow the brain to focus, especially when you need deep focus periods. And this speaks to the value of exercise throughout our days to upgrade our brain energy. Similarly, the new book out by the Alloways called The Working Memory Advantage has a whole section around brain foods, and I'm not going to go into that right now, except to say that to encourage us all to be experimenting with brain foods, foods that improve your brain energy for a few hours afterwards. These are the ones that make a difference to me. Chia bars, if you've ever tried chia seed, I'm not advertising these products, but I find that if I need a breath of fresh air in my brain, that helps. Berries, lean protein, wild salmon, lots of water, a little dose of espresso with the antioxidants and the caffeine. So there are various foods that do better at energizing our brains, and we're all different, so it comes back to us to be our own self-scientists and sort out which foods make the most difference in a day, especially a day of intense demands on the brain. Now, our emotional energy is important, as I mentioned, and too many negative emotions, too much stress, as we say, hijack and overwhelm the mind's ability to control the brain. Negative emotions that come up from the limbic system in the wrong dose, or if we can't cope or don't bounce back well, intrude and impair the functioning of our prefrontal cortex. So this is where meta-awareness comes in. So this is the meta-awareness brain state. And the way we use this when at any point in the day is when we pause. I call this the pause brain state. When you pause, it takes some agility. You pull yourself out of the deep focus. Like right now, I'm deeply focused in flow as I present these slides. And I would pull myself out and say, am I going too fast? Is my energy right? Do I need a sip of water? How's it going? What am I feeling? So these would be these self-observing moments. Shelley mentioned the frontal pole. You see the frontal poles are active at the top of this brain graphic. And so that means we're in metacognition. We are, in fact, getting meta. We are able to watch ourselves in the movie, to be watching us as the actor in the movie rather than being the actor. This is the ability to separate from the noise in one's brain, to get a little distance. This state looks a lot like strategic thinking. It's like getting a strategic perspective on self. This is one of the brain states that meditations are helping us learn how to do, to be able to observe the movie, to be able to observe ourselves rather than be in it. And if you've read some of the research and literature around this, there's a price you pay for going meta, because you actually are not as deeply into the original brain state, the thinking, the doing, whatever it was you were in. You've got to separate out of it and devote some bandwidth to the observing part of the brain. And so it's not a place to live all day, because then you take yourself out of the deep focus periods. However, it is a place to visit in an agile, quick way to catch yourself before you're about to make a mistake, when you're about to be distracted, when emotion is hijacking you. So Shelley, over to you.
Yes, so the meta-awareness state is very interesting. Some people have compared it to going from the subject to the object. So you are now looking at yourself as an object rather than being the object. And the part of the brain, again, that's associated with meta-awareness in particular is this frontal pole area, that bright orange area. And research has found that one part of the frontal pole region, called the medial anterior prefrontal cortex, monitors your feeling and emotion states, while another part of the region, the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, is more active in monitoring your cognition or your thoughts. So this part of the brain is monitoring both emotions and thoughts. And the goal of meta-awareness is to get into this state, turning down the volume on the judgment center. So non-judgmentally observing your cognitions and your emotions. And this gives you the opportunity in this brief time that you do this to determine whether those emotions or cognitions are serving you well, or whether you need to make a change in your brain state. But as Margaret said, this isn't a place to live, because then you would constantly be living as an observer of your own life rather than the liver of your own life. In other words, when you're in meta-awareness, you're not in the moment, so to speak. So again, frontal pole is activated, and other parts of the brain are in various states of activation depending upon whether you are in a highly emotional or a highly cognitive state at the time you choose to go meta.
Thank you. And one thing to note here is that we talk often about being non-judgmental. And what you see in these depictions of the brain is that non-judgmental is simply about dialing down the activity in the judgment centers of the brain. So it's a turning down of judgment, not a pushing it away, not a trying or efforting to be non-judgmental. It is simply moving your attentional resource away from the judgment centers so that you can observe.
Exactly. And if you think about it as the volume on a radio dial and you just gently turn it down, that's all you need to do. Eventually you will have control over this and you'll become very good at it.
So let's take a moment to talk about mind wandering, and I want to celebrate mind wandering for a moment because it is something that is getting a lot of criticism. One of the reasons that there's such an interest in the world in teaching everyone to meditate is that our minds are wandering a lot when we don't want them to wander. When we need deep focus, they're leaving the focus. They're not listening to our mates or our children or our colleagues. They're not staying focused on the task because they're wandering. The brain wandering, a mind wandering state, is a state of high creativity. Shelley will explain why in a moment. When the default regions, which are down the middle of the brain, as you see, are on, the brain is solving problems and figuring things out, and we're not doing anything. We could be in the shower, going for a jog, and my thought would be that most of us get too little of this every day because every moment of the day is goal-oriented. We jam-pack every second. We can't stand in line even anymore without checking our phones. And so the brain doesn't get a chance to do what it wants to do, like a dog running without a leash. It doesn't get unleashed enough in a day. And so I want to just pay ode to the value of mind wandering and having real downtime where you let your mind go and you have no ambition or no goal. So it has its place, but it does interfere, and it's important to know when and where it's helpful. Over to you, Shelley.
I think what you said is very important, Margaret. If you don't schedule some time during the day, some downtime for your brain, then your brain is going to go into this downtime state at periods when it isn't convenient for you. For instance, in the middle of a meeting or sometime when you really need to be goal-focused. So the mind wants to wander a certain period of each day, and having specific times of the day that are set aside for it is very beneficial. Gives your executive center a break, so to speak. So what we have here is you can see that the center line of the brain, those areas are activated during mind wandering. And you don't need to purposefully turn them on. What you need to do is purposefully dial down the executive center and the judgment center. And then these areas will automatically come online. The yellow areas that you see there are the memory centers. And you'll also see that the front part, the top of the brain, by the way, is at the top of the chart is the front of the brain. We see that the me centers and you centers are often bright orange in this area. And that's probably because when we're daydreaming or mind wandering, our minds often wander to thoughts relevant to ourselves, something self-referential. Mind wandering is important. It is what you might call stream of consciousness, because one of the functions of the executive center is to filter out information that's irrelevant to your current goals or to survival. Now, if we turn down the volume on those filters, it allows more information into conscious awareness. And that's what's happening when we have stream of consciousness. It also allows more ideas that are fomenting below the level of conscious awareness to feed forward into consciousness. And that's when we get a lot of those aha moments. So mind wandering is important. It's the time when the mind is sort of digesting and synthesizing all the information and the things that have gone on during the day. And so we want you to schedule a little bit of that time into each day.
Thank you. So now we're beginning to get ourselves ready for a coaching session, and we're going to take you a tour through how to use these various brain states as coaches. Of course, you can think about this from many perspectives, how your client can use these brain states in a given day, but we want to make this at first relevant to you. So one way, as I mentioned already, to upgrade your energy, the energy to support use of these brain states well, is to get intentional, to harness your drive, to get fuel from the reward center to, in fact, help you go deep and be agile. So you might take a moment before a coaching session to recall why the session matters. You can also do this step within a session to have the client get in touch with their drive, their intentional area of their resources in order to get more out of their thinking and creative processing. Now, as you start a coaching session, you might want to spend a few moments getting ready. Maybe you've got a checklist. Maybe you've got to get your desk sorted out. Maybe you want to check your notes, the last notes with the client. Make sure that you've got invoices up to date. Whatever you do to prepare, this is where you're now bringing in your left prefrontal cortex, moving back into the high executive control. We've been talking about two states that don't use high executive control, so you're making an agile shift now into the preparation mode. Over to you, Shelley.
Okay, yes. So in this brain activation state, your executive center is turned on high, and you have activated what's called the executive attentional network, which includes the prefrontal, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and those association areas in the rear of the brain. And all of these are connected and turned on high, and you've turned down the parts of the brain that are associated with mind wandering. So when you're thinking about consciously directing your thought, think about the lateral sides of your brain turning on. When you're thinking about mind wandering, you think about the middle part of your brain turning on. Sometimes by just visualizing turning on and off these two parts of the brain will help you to get into the appropriate brain activation state. Margaret.
Thank you. And what's also interesting here is that the judgment centers are down. So you're not in an analytical, evaluating, judgmental mode either. So that's important. So now
I forgot to mention that the reward centers are turned on when you're in that state, that you are being rewarded for planning and getting ready. You're actually getting a little reward for doing that. Go ahead.
So it feels good to get prepared, to be well prepared. Yeah, great point.
Checking something off the checklist, that gives you a little jolt of reward in the brain. So getting prepared is very rewarding.
Great. So now, where do you want to be as you start a coaching session? And this is where open awareness is a beautiful place to move. And this is an agile shift because the prepare state is you're living up in your top left frontal brain, and the open awareness state, you see the frontal cortex is turned down significantly. Ideally, you're not thinking about yourself or anything. You are simply in your senses. And this, I find this a reboot brain state. Even just a couple of deep breaths and moving into this state, emptying the prefrontal cortex is a beautiful way to get into the present moment. So when people talk about getting present, this is what we mean. That means you're not in your thinking brain, which is dealing with past, present, future. You're simply in your sensory brain, sensing what's happening in this moment. And that's an experiencing state, not a thinking state. Over to you, Shelley.
Yes, so clearly we have deactivation in the prefrontal in the executive center of the prefrontal cortex. And we have activation of sensory, perception, and association centers. You'll notice that there's a bright orange area on the right side of the brain, kind of halfway back. There has been some research that says that this part of the brain in the right hemisphere, it's part of the right temporal lobe, may be associated with increased interest in novel stimuli. So when this part is active, you are becoming more interested in the stimuli around you. And there's also reward for this as well. Back to you, Margaret.
Thank you. So this is the open, curious, non-judgmental place that we all talk about as coaches. And here I want to show you the evaluate brain state quickly. We're going to come back to it at the end, which if it's turned on here, we've got the me regions on. So this is self-evaluation. This also you could turn the me regions off and it would be other evaluation. But this is the judgmental brain state. So look at it compared to open awareness. They're basically at the far corners of the map, the evaluate brain state being right at the highest, most left place, open awareness the furthest down on the right and at the bottom. So here you see why the open awareness brain state just automatically gets you out of judging both yourself and the other person. So now you're prepared. You have done your mind wandering to give it a break. You have gone meta to notice how you're feeling. You've gotten prepared. And you have moved into open awareness to be present. So the first step in a coaching session is to move into the connecting mode where we are in sync, where we have harmony, where we are feeling the presence and able to be compassionate towards another human being. And this is where we bring in the rapport brain state. This brain state, I don't have it side by side with the prepare and the evaluate, but it's also very different. It's more in the middle, further to the right of the and down in our map. Very little thinking going on. We are in connecting mode with another human being. And what I love about this, and Shelley's going to tell you more, is that what's interesting is that this brain state is creative. When we let go of thinking, planning, doing, and simply connect, you see the association centers are on, and the default network is on. And so we are in a more creative, we can think about a good question to ask. We are present and able to take in what's happening. So there's a lot of benefits to this rapport brain state for creativity, not just connection. Over to you, Shelley.
Yeah, so one of the things that's important about the rapport brain state is you have areas of the medial prefrontal cortex, the me and you parts of the brain are active, but the judgment center is turned down. You'll also see that the yellow areas in the middle are the reward center. So the reward centers are being activated because rapport is basically a very pleasant feeling. Some of the most important work that's been done on rapport has to do with the orange areas near the center line going down toward the back of the brain. These areas are called the precuneus and the posterior and the superior parietal cortex. These areas have been shown to be active when you are in empathy with another person. So they're very important in forming that empathic state with another person. So again, empathy is associated with these areas, with the me and you centers in the front of the brain, and with the association centers and the reward centers. All of these things are active when you are establishing rapport with another person, while executive and judgment centers, the volume is turned down. Margaret.
Thank you. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that you see that we're giving you these depictions, but they can be experienced in different ways. For instance, you might not turn on the empathy region while you're connecting. Think about all those relationships in your life where you don't feel empathy. So that becomes a layer that one has to bring into the rapport to make this happen. And again, as we begin to dial up and dial down these different brain activities, we're all going to be much better at bringing forward what we need in a given moment. So now we move into one of the more creative brain states that has to do with imagining and envisioning envisioning new possibilities. This is what you might use if you ask your client to sort of picture the outcome they want, both in the session, in the future, around a particular challenging issue. And this is a highly creative state with the association centers and default networks turned on. Over to you, Shelley.
Yes, so the default network is turned on. The executive centers are basically turned off, although you can see there's a little activation in the left prefrontal cortex, so that that is the part of the brain that is going to be sending the goal of what you want to imagine to the rest of your brain, to the parts of your brain that are more below the level of conscious awareness. Now, the brain utilizes the memory machinery that's designed to process visual stimuli that comes in from our eyes, as I told you before. And so in addition to visualizing the outcome of future events, and some researchers call this future memory, you can also use this to generate totally new ideas and projects and products and fictional narratives. Maybe some of you have heard of the quote attributed to Michelangelo. In every block of marble, I see a statue standing before me, shaped and perfect. I have only to cut away the parts of the marble that aren't part of the statue. That was a liberal interpretation of that quote. But anyway, the idea is that he could see so perfectly in his mind what he wanted to create, that basically all he had to do then was take his hands and chip away the parts that weren't part of the statue. So being able to imagine is an extremely creative and valuable thing that our brains do for us, and everybody has the ability to imagine. It's important in almost everything we do. It allows us to see outcomes without actually having to experience those outcomes, and that can be very life-promoting. Back to you. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say is that when you're in this state, you are also able to receive some of those aha experiences.
What's interesting also is that this brain state, if you see it side by side with mind wandering, you'll see that it looks almost identical, except that this executive control region that's turned on a little bit. So it's like we are directing our mind wandering. We're directing our daydreaming, our fantasies towards a specific outcome that we want.
That's a great point, Margaret.
So thank you. So let's move on. This is my favorite brain state. Look at this. This is the collaborate brain state. This could be a thinking collaboration, and we're not making a distinction between a flow-like collaboration, what we as coaches call the intuitive dance or relational flow or co-flow. So we don't have the nuanced studies to be able to separate these, but let's just say this is a very rich brain state when you create a mind cloud with others, one or more, and that brings forward, you know, lots of new ideas and possibilities. This brain state has, as you see, an awful lot of activity: top, back, front, sides, and I guess not so much in the deeper cortical regions, but basically a lot is turned on. And this is why our rich collaboration is so generative, why new ideas and insights come when we get into this particular state. And as we all know, you don't just jump into this state. You need the rapport phase. You may need to bring in motivation. You may need to be imagining. So you want to kind of power up the brain, both brains of coach and client, before you get into this this place, kind of like the warm-up. And this is what you can count on, what we can count on to help clients move from subject to object, find new possibilities, be energized around things they hadn't thought of before, which propel them forward. Over to you, Shelley.
Yes, so I think it's a good idea to plan on having the collaborate brain state flow naturally from the rapport brain state. And I just wanted to clarify a little something that I mentioned during rapport. When we talk about empathy, we're not necessarily saying, oh, I feel your pain. What we're saying with empathy is that I understand and can anticipate your intentions and perceptions. So being able to see what the other person is seeing and being able to understand what the other person might be thinking. Then moving from rapport into collaborate, basically what you're doing is you're turning on the executive centers. You've got the rapport state, turn on the executive centers, and a very interesting study that was recently done by McCabe et al. Found that when people are collaborating with each other, they also have activity in that frontal pole region that we talked about that was part of meta-awareness. So it gives you an overview of what you are doing with the other person. I think that's very interesting that the frontal pole is active in both of these brain activation states. Again, when you're collaborating, your fear center is turned down. Me and you centers are active, and again, the executive center, so that you can make decisions and plans accord with the other person, and the activation of the frontal pole. All very interesting.
And I guess, Shelley, you'd say that the activity of the frontal pole in this case is different than in meta-awareness.
Definitely, and one of the things that it's important to realize is that different parts of the brain may have different functions depending upon the activation of the neural network. So just like you, each of you out there is part of different networks. You may be part of your child's PTO. You may be on a tennis team. You may be on a collaborating team at your work. Obviously, as a coach, you are collaborating with your clients. So you're part of a lot of different networks. So is each part of our brain part of different networks. And that part of the brain may have different functions depending upon which network it's associated with at the moment.
So let's just take a moment and visit flow. This is a depiction of flow when one is in flow by oneself as opposed to relational flow. But I want to add it to this presentation because we know from Csikszentmihalyi's work that this particular brain state, which is a slightly defocused brain state, you see the executive center is turned down, which means we're not planning, thinking, pushing. We're in fact letting go of control to flow. We're letting go. We're not, if you think about playing a game, if you start thinking about where to put the tennis racket and how to cock your wrist, the more you're thinking, the less able you are to just flow. And so flow is a fabulous state of slight defocus. It's a very creative state, and it's one that we want all to have more of in our lives. Over to you, Shelley.
Okay, the flow state, in fact, is very interesting. When you're in flow, it feels like you are not consciously making decision after decision, but that the decisions and actions that you're participating in are coming naturally, almost automatically by themselves. we see activation here of obviously the reward center, which is the yellow part in the center of the brain, and the orange parts just below that are the premotor cortex. So the premotor cortex is the part of the brain that is devising an action plan, and it's devising an action plan and actually delivering the action. Many of the studies that have been done on flow have been done on, for instance, improvisational jazz musicians. And what they see is that they have low activation of the executive center, but once again, very interesting, there is some activation of that frontal pole. Earlier I told you that the frontal pole also seems to be associated with taking pieces of information and putting them together in a story or a narrative, and that may be well what's happening in the state of flow, is that your brain is putting together actions or thoughts in a narrative that just naturally flows like a river or like a stream. So again, we have premotor parts of the brain active, we have the reward center active, the association centers, and the vision centers all active, along with some activation of the frontal pole in the state of flow.
So we're getting close to the end. The next one we're going to talk about, which is one that is new because it's based on what is still fairly controversial, the work around mirror neurons. The idea that two brains can have a mind meld. You remember this scene from Star Trek where you have a mind meld with a masterful expert to learn from them. This is the brain state that kids use to learn before they know how to read and instructions and take notes. So it is a natural ability of the brain to be able to learn by absorbing, learn through one's senses, learn through experiencing the other person. And this is a state that most of us could spend more time on. You know, when we go to lectures and we're learning, we're often in note-taking mode. And while we might have better notes and recall of the language, we may in fact take more away from the experience by just simply mind melding with the person we're learning from, the masterful person we want to learn from. We may absorb more of what they can do through this state of embodied learning. Where this is relevant to coaching, I think, is that we talk about coaching presence, and we think about our presence as a coach as impacting our clients as much as what we do, so that whatever brain waves that are in our brains get radiated outwards and get taken up in this mind meld. So when we're radiating humor or presence or courage or calm or confidence or zest, all of those energies are basically available for clients to take up. And so this is where we are, in fact, influencing through the rapport and connective modes, actually influencing their brain states. And we do know that two people in empathy, or two people in chemistry, their brain activity patterns do sync up. So this is a way of thinking about, this state is a way of thinking about how coaching presence works. Over to you, Shelley.
Yes, so research on the state of embodied learning suggests that mirror neurons, which Margaret mentioned, and by the way, these are also seen in the rapport and the collaborative brain states, are often active when a person is in a state of embodied learning. They've been observed, these mirror neurons, to fire in humans both when they're observing others performing actions and when they themselves are actually performing the action. Some regions that are rich in mirror neurons seem to be involved in embodied learning include an area just behind the executive center. This area is actually called the pars opercularis, and it's rich in mirror neurons and seems to be active during embodied learning. We also see that the memory network is active during embodied learning, and also supplemental motor cortex. So that area is also rich in motor neurons. So when you're watching another person's gestures, facial expressions, all of these things may be active in your own brain and help you to recall and to learn what it is that you're experiencing at the moment. So we see that there are parts of the default network that are also operational in embodied learning. And the me center, fear centers are down. Reward center is increased in activation. The vision center is increased in activation. The executive center is turned down, so you're not consciously aware of this type of learning. Margaret.
Okay, so let's go to the Agile state. I'm looking at our time here, so it looks like we're going to take every minute with our presentation. We've been taking our time, and we hope that's okay, and we can certainly come back for more questions, and we're happy to take questions, but I think we're going to need the rest of the time. So let's move to an Agile brain state, which is the creative, the nonlinear, divergent brainstorming, you know, the kind of brain state that Mozart used when he was driving home from dinner and a symphony appeared in his head. You know, this sort of out of nowhere, the song, the lyrics, the whatever creative thing just kind of turns up in your head. This is this amazing state, and those of you out there with creative brains, I do not find this one easy. I rely more on mind wandering for my creativity, but some of you are just idea-generating machines, I'm sure, and this is a very natural, an agile place to be. So Shelley, walk us through this one.
Okay, what's really interesting is some of the research that's been done on this. Now, we've all heard that creativity is a right brain process. That isn't exactly true, but what some is that the right executive center has a rich connections with the left association centers, and this network is actually active when you're doing things such as brainstorming or thinking divergently. Divergent thinking is the ability to come up with multiple solutions to an open-ended problem. So highly creative people spend a lot of time in this state. Obviously, it is rewarding. The reward center is on. And again, we're seeing connections between the right executive center and the left association centers in particular. And one of the things that's also happening is the executive center in the left hemisphere, the volume is turned down somewhat, but not completely, to allow more information through those filters to feed forward into conscious awareness, so that you can use that information and combine it and recombine it in novel and original ways to come up with creative ideas.
It's also important to note that the judgment center is turned down, so there's no such thing as a bad idea.
I'm sorry, I forgot that. That is majorly, majorly important. Turning down the judgment center when you're coming up with new ideas. You don't judge them. You just let them flow.
Great. So let's move to another agile brain state, and this is the strategic thinking, the zooming out. So you're in the nitty-gritty exploration of the details of a situation, and then you pull out and say, so what's the pattern here? What's the big picture here? If we had the meta-awareness side by side, you'd see that they look almost the same, except there's more activity in the strategic brain state because it is a more active thinking state. But nevertheless, they're both about getting perspective. They're both about standing back and seeing things from a distance and being able to notice patterns. So, Shelley, tell us about
the difference between the meta-awareness state and the strategic brain state is in the meta-awareness state, you are aware of your own thoughts. You are objectively looking at your own thoughts and emotions. In the strategic brain state, you are objectively looking at what we call problems. Anything that requires action is a, quote, problem. And so you would be looking outside of yourself and objectively assessing a situation, a problem, an event. And that's why we see that the me and you brain states are turned down. And the association centers, the executive centers, and the judgment centers are all active, so that you can look at situations from a distance, from above, and strategically plan how to deal with them.
Great. So we're almost done. We've been neglecting the judgmental brain state until now, and it has its place. All brain states have their place. And as we close a coaching session, what we're usually doing is evaluating, helping client evaluate what options are possible, what actions to take, what steps to take, and maybe even assess how the session went. And so there is a place for judgment as we come to the end of a session. And what we've done here is to show you just how evaluating and self-evaluating are very similar, except that in the self-evaluate brain state, which you wouldn't normally be doing, your client might be using, the me center is also turned on. So, Shelley, do you want to just give us a quick walkthrough for this one?
Right. So it's very important for the human brain to make judgments, to take all of the information that it's been given through the executive center and come up with judgments. But the judgments should not be judgments of the inner self. If you need to accept criticism or give criticism, you want to do it in a non-self-referential way. So the difference between evaluate and self-evaluate is, of course, the me center is turned on in self-evaluate, and we often refer to this state as the inner critic. When judgment centers and the me center is turned on, you are likely judging yourself and usually judging yourself harshly. So what you want to be able to do in conjunction with your client is to be able to make judgments, see areas for improvement without that personal aspect that is associated with self-referential me activation. Back to you, Margaret.
Great. So there is more to come. We have made a stab at laying out the coordinates for the brain states that are common in use for most of us in most days, and certainly in coaching. However, I foresee that we'll be able to add to these brain states other kinds of brain functions. For instance, the region that relates to gratitude or acceptance. We talked a little bit about curiosity. Perhaps that could be layered on to the other brain states. Humor, although the coordinates are not fully fleshed out, is another sort of partial or a brain state that can be added to others. And so what we find then is that this map is really a continuum where we're moving in somewhat of a flow-like way among these different states and turning on different regions as we move through all of the various capacities of the brain. What we most want to leave you with today is the understanding and appreciation that there are many ways to use your brain in a day, in a coaching session, in a life, and that as we get more conscious and concrete about what is happening in each of these brain states, we can ultimately be far more masterful around using our brains in a given day to perform at our best, whatever that happens to be. So we invite you to use your brain well, to be intentional, to go deep, to be agile, to use diverse set of brain states, and to stay energized, however that works best for you. Shelley, do you want to add a closing comment as well?
I might just say that it's important for you to try to figure out what brain state you're in a given moment, especially if you feel that you are being ineffective. Try to figure out what brain state you're in, and then either try to consciously change your brain state or try to find an activity that matches your current brain state so that you don't totally butt your head, so to speak, against the wrong task. We know that you can gain control over your brain activation states. We have a lot of research that shows this is possible. And many of my clients have found that just by visualizing the parts of the brain they want to turn on, they are able to get into that state more easily. Thank you all for joining us today. Margaret?
Yes, and I know we have a few questions. Stephanie, I'd be happy to stay on for a few minutes unless you think we need to end right at a time for those people who want to and have time. There's
Sure.
just a few we could take.
Sure. I think if we can stay on for an extra 5 minutes to answer a few of the questions, that's fine. I also, Margaret and Shelley, do have record of who asked the specific question, so if we want to reach out following the webinar, if that's easier for folks as well, we can follow up that way.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to take then, so for those of you who need to go, that's great, and we do have a recording, so you can come back and listen to the part at the end if you wish to do that. Carrie asks about the coaching skills we all know, listening, reflection, empathy, openness, non-judgment, and what strategies one might use to move into these. I guess the simple and quick answer to this, Carrie, would be to appreciate first that listening, reflection, empathy, curiosity, non-judgment, all likely, although it's not mapped out, and it's very difficult to put coaches and clients into MRI machines while they're in coaching sessions, so it's not easy to map this out. But I think if you think about this metaphorically, that each of these particular coaching skills likely do map to some kind of network, a set of networks active in the brain. And one of the ways to tap into those is to recall when you did this best, you know, when your listening was at its deepest, when your reflections were at their most creative and powerful, when you were the most empathetic, when you're the most curious, when you are in accepting mode and you've dialed down judgment. So you want to basically be able to bring to mind, using the imagination, of what did that network and the sensation of that actually feel like, so that eventually, like you know, changing gears in a car, you can say, okay, I'm going to dial up the openness right now. I'm going to dial down the judgment. I'm going to dial up empathy. And the great thing about the brain is that you don't have to tell it which network to turn down and which reasons to turn on and off. It will, in fact, know what you mean if you've got a picture of that in your mind. Shelley, do you want to add to that?
I would just say that the very act of realizing, for instance, in the states that you mentioned, that you need to turn down the volume on judgment, just reminding yourself to do that automatically will put you in a more receptive and open state where you can develop rapport. It's turning down that judgment dial, and just the very act of saying that to myself. Okay, turning down the judgment now. Pretty soon you will be able to do that just by telling yourself to do it.
Right. And that brings home for me, Shelley, this, the fact that some of us have different kinds of issues. For those of us who lean towards the left prefrontal, highly controlled, self-regulating, disciplined, you know, in charge, in control kind of brain states, we have trouble with turning things down. We have trouble with letting things in, our emotions, stimuli. And so the growth edge for us, those of us in that camp, is to learn how to turn down the thinking and evaluating and the being in control and let go. Whereas the folks who have great ease in staying in a spontaneous, impulsive mode without a lot of control and discipline have to turn up those regions in order to be more productive and organized and get on top of things and be places on time. And so each of us, you need to understand what you have as your strengths and weaknesses, and to recognize that not just, you know, stay the way you are, but appreciate that you can learn by practice to activate these other brain states. As Shelley mentioned early on, we've all got these brain regions, they all are functioning well, and we just may need to learn to use them better.
Everybody has what I call their mental comfort zone. And for those people who really do like to be in control, it can be extremely uncomfortable to try to turn down the volume on the executive or the CEO of the brain. It can really make them feel very uncomfortable and vulnerable. So one thing I would suggest is that you practice doing this, but don't practice doing it at strategic times, at times where you need to do it. It needs to be it's a skill that needs to be learned outside of outside of the moment, so to speak. When you don't have anything at stake, these are the times to practice this. Can I say one other thing? Since
yes, go ahead.
Now, often people who are highly controlled and have difficulty letting go, there may be something that they don't want to think about, and that's why they keep tight control over their thoughts and emotions. So trying to figure out what that might be and exploring that a little bit is something, again, that you would do during quiet hours, and that might also help people who are very tightly controlled to turn down that volume a little bit. Let that filter. Remember, the goal is to allow things to filter into conscious awareness that would ordinarily be filtered out. So you want to loosen those filters a little. And sometimes getting that image in mind can be helpful as well.
Now, the next question, there's a question here, Shelley, about the science that led you to be able to build the brain states. Do you want to just take a moment to explain your incredible work to put these together?
So each of the brain states that we've been working on, what I've tried to do is do a review of all the literature. We call it literature, but it's really just research studies that have been done on brain areas and the particular functions that we have in mind for that brain state. So when you're collaborating with another person, that would mean that we would want to do a review of all of the brain imaging studies that have looked at collaboration between individuals. And as it turns out, there's quite a body of research on that. Some of it's very interesting. Some of the studies have two people in two different brain imaging machines and have them work on a project together. Some have one person in a brain imaging machine working with somebody who's outside of the machine. So for each of these different brain activation states, we look at what we want the end result to be, whether it's rapport or open awareness, and then we go back and review all of the work that's been done in that area. And this includes a review of approximately somewhere between 30 to 40 different neuroscience journals. Plus getting in touch with, I have friends and colleagues that are doing a lot of work in a lot of these different areas. So I've also been picking their brains. But it's primarily a review of the published research in peer-reviewed journals.
Great. Steve asked whether this is covered in the Organize Your Mind book, and it is not. There are most certainly some principles. All of the Organize Your Mind book is in this model, but this is a brand new model that came out of my collaboration with Shelley. Someone asks whether there's a particular order recommended for accessing these brain states. I think what we put together today is a good process. Doesn't mean that you would use it exactly in this order, but I think if you need at least a starting point, that's there. I mean, clearly we've not studied this yet and shown, I can imagine there's so much more to do now that we've laid this out to understand, the order of brain states, which ones for how long in a day, what in fact leads to the optimal creativity and performance. And right now, that now we've kind of provided a toolbox for people to be able to study those things.
Right. And I think it's important that people understand that your brain map is a model. It's based, each individual part of it is based on research, but the model itself has not been researched. And so we have to lay out the model first, and now we begin to do the research, and we invite other people to research the model as well.
Great. Jeffrey asks, how can we best introduce these concepts to our clients? They don't need it. They may not be as curious. And I think then this is where we need to kind of evoke the stages of readiness to change. If people are really not ready to learn more about this, then there's not much point in raising it, except perhaps through your enthusiastic interest in it and pointing out to people which brain state they're in and what they might do to shift brain states. So I think we can only really bring this to people who are ready. Kathleen asked about how we can describe how this relates to confidence, and that's a really good question, Kathleen, and I guess what I would say is that what certainly, I'm sure for Shelley too, what has driven me to work so hard on this model and the original Organize Your Mind framework is that I really know people are struggling and feeling out of control and kind of lost around, what do I do with my mind? Where is my mind? I've lost it. And they feel this state of frenzy and distraction and overwhelm, and they just simply don't know where to start. And so probably the most satisfying piece of this for me is giving people a framework so they have some starting points and they get some traction. And if they feel more confidence in their ability to manage the wild and crazy and amazing resources of the brain, then yes, I can imagine their confidence would go up. And Shelley, you'd probably say the same on creativity, is that right? When you broke it down, it becomes more accessible to people.
Yes, I believe that's true. Neuroscientists have a saying, the mind is what the brain does. And it's very comforting to a lot of people that have a frenzied mind to realize that what's going on in the mind is the result of the brain activation. And as soon as you realize you can control your brain activation, now mind you, it takes practice, a considerable amount of practice, just like learning to shoot hoops. But once you realize that you have control over your brain activation states, and that brain activation states determine a lot of what's going on in your mind and your mindset, then it gives you this real sense of control and increases confidence in your ability to handle any situation.
Great. Couple final questions. People have asked about practical exercises, and in the track that Shelley and I did in September, in the video, a 2-hour video, there are a number of exercises that we used, so that might be helpful. And someone's asked about connecting it to disposition. I'm assuming you mean the genetic basis for one's personality and the fact that some of us, I've got strengths, some brain states come easier than others. And I think, yes, I think that that's likely the case, but we've never really had the tool here to really help people understand what that means and where their brains live more. And so I think there's an opportunity to upgrade assessments and appreciation of this. And my point about diversity of brain states, and Shelley, you make that point too, Shelley, in the creative process in your book, Your Creative Brain, because you've laid out this set of diverse brain states that all together lead to creativity, and that it's much more diversity than often what people consider as the creative process. And so I think at the end of the day, we're all going to lean towards what we naturally find easier and struggle with, the things we don't find easy. And I think the call of this model is the opportunity to really explore, is it possible that if you diversified and developed more brain states, would you in fact find yourself performing at a higher level? And so that's a question. And I guess it's fair to say then in closing that this is a good example of science in motion, because the basic science that Shelley has put together to build these states, the innovation to create a new framework for that, all of that leads to new possible lines of research, and we've begun to touch on those today, and we really welcome your interest in helping with assessments and experiments and exercises and ways to make this possible for more people. Shelley, your last word?
Well, I think one of the things that has really, as I've done this research, has really come home to me is how amazing our brains are and how much more respect I have for the different things our brain can do. And, excuse me, oh, I almost made it through. I've been suffering from a cold. I'll leave it there, Margaret. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all for those of you who stayed to the end, and it's been a delight to share this with you, and feel free to email Shelley or me. You can find us through the Institute. Margaret at instituteofcoaching.org is probably the simplest. Onward and upward, as I say, and enjoy using all of your brain states today and in the future. Thanks, Stephanie, for helping us get organized and get this done today.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, everyone, for participating.
Everybody, stretch your mind.
Stretch your minds, yes. Thank you, everyone.